But before we start, let me use this opportunity to thank Mats Rollén. I remember when he sent me an email last fall and asked how could we go on with this program and project, and in which place in Finland we could organize a seminar, debate, discussion, because they had those discussions before in Turku and in Vaasa. Oulu, okay, Uleåborg. Oh. And then I asked him to contact Anita, and now we are here. I thought that it could never happen in April. That was almost before Christmas, and here we are. And then that reminded me, when I got an email from you, something which happened 30 years earlier. It was one morning, Karl-Johan Kleberi from Statens Kulturråd phoned me from Stockholm and said, Ritva, we should do something. And I'll take a boat and come to Helsinki, and we should start a project between Sweden and Finland. And we started a lifelong project together with him. And unfortunately he retired, but we even did Vietnamese cultural policy review together and celebrated his 80th birthday. So I have a long-lasting relationship with my Swedish colleagues and Swedish researchers. And I also, that if you want to know the sort of a history of Arts Council of Finland Research Unit, it was Karl-Johan who said to me that Ritva, something has to be done. You have good researchers in the country, but you don't have an institute. And I walked into the Arts Council and said, you need an institute, and it's been there for 30 years. So that was a sort of a little baby of you Swedes and pushing to do something, and now we want to push you to do something, and we are grateful that we can start again new kind of cooperation, because of course we have the Forum for Nordic Cultural Policy Researchers, we have a joint journal, and very many forms of collaboration and working together. But what you are offering now is a sort of a lively online information system, and it gives us all opportunity to benefit from that system. And that's why I was asking that, how long have you got funding? And if we have 5 years' time to sort of work with you, you know that the famous word nowadays is crowdfunding.
So I learned, yes.
Yes, crowdfunding, and this is now the future of culture, anyway, in different fields. But today our discussion now continues actually what we just heard before coffee break, regionalisation or centralisation, and we had a history of 600 years. But we are concentrating this afternoon only the very recent years. And of course, as all of you working in the field of cultural policy, that you know that decentralisation, participation, identity have been the major goals of cultural policies since they have been formed in sort of modern times, since the 1960s. And a lot of attempts have been made in Europe, some more successful than others. And now we are, in a way, in a new phase. I remember in the 1980s, we were all in the circles discussing about the French reform in decentralization, and this sort of a debate, administrative reforms have been taking place all over Europe. And of course, I experienced myself the most drastic reform wave in Europe, present-day Europe, was when the Berlin Wall came down, and very centralized systems, like the East and Central European countries, had to start to decentralize their cultural policies. And it was a painful process, and it's not yet at the end of it. Nor is it for us, and we have been doing this for years and years, or centuries. And so therefore, this will be a very, very interesting discussion. I must say that I have been studying the whole weekend all your studies and writings, particularly Jenny's and Topias, about this reform and about possible effects. And then I found 3 words, 3 models: kulturpåsen, portfolio model, and koffert model.
Koffert model.
Yeah, but then I didn't have 2 weeks' time to really study the difference between these different cooperation, negotiation models between the government and the regions. But I hope that Jenny will be telling us about it. And I really like that portfolio model. but then that didn't go through. I was sure it won't. It was absolutely too radical attempt to reform the governance of culture in Sweden. And so Jenny Johannisson comes from Borås and Center for Cultural Policy Studies, and is one of the most known cultural policy researchers in Europe, globally, in the Nordic countries. And her speciality, you ask her to speak about anything and she speaks about regions. So now you can really talk about regions. And then we have Pirnes, who is our second speaker, coming from the Ministry of Education and Culture. But Esa has a sort of two chairs. He's a bureaucrat at the ministry, or civil servant. He doesn't like the name, but you cannot deny it. And making important decisions, but at the same time, very active in the field of academic research, and did his PhD to this university. So you are now talking here with your academic hat, I hope. Yeah, this is what we are expecting from you. And we decided that the two presentations will be made in consequence, and then we have to debate together. Because if we start debating Jenny's paper, I will take the next half an hour, ask you questions, and then we'll have to finish the session, and I tell Esa that you come and start tomorrow. So if you agree that this will be the case. And please, really, really, let's have a lively discussion, because this is such an important issue in Europe, and of course globally, in Europe and in the Nordic countries, and particularly in Sweden, when they now are trying to create really genuine regions. So please have the floor.
Thank you, Ritva, and thank you, Mats, for inviting me to this colloquium, and thank you, Anita, for again hosting a colloquium on cultural policy research. For anyone doing research on cultural policy, it always feels like coming home when coming to Jyväskylä. And also, I would like to thank our previous speakers for providing Esa and my session with such an excellent introduction. And it was actually my fault that we had to change in the program, but it wasn't my fault, it was Finnair's fault, because they changed their flight schedule. But I'm glad now, because I think that it was much better that you started off and laid the foundation for the rest of us. And we were talking during the coffee break that we will feel quite vulgar and sweeping and with no knowledge in history, but thankfully you've provided us with that, so that was great. Yes, regionalisation, it's a very difficult word to say. Regionalisation or centralisation, main trends in Swedish cultural policy is what I'm going to talk about for, well, at least 20 minutes. I want to start off with my perspective on these issues. Since I started my PhD studies, I've been interested in subnational cultural policy. And the reason for that is, of course, that there is almost no research on subnational cultural policy. Almost all research still on cultural policy is on the national level. And what really interested me with subnational cultural policy was actually political globalization processes and the parallel processes of globalization, or rather internationalization and decentralization, and how these processes evolve in the cultural policy field. And my point of interest is basically new alliances and points of conflict between cultural policy at different levels of government, local, regional, national, and international. Since the theoretical perspective that I apply is based on the notion that policy at any level is created and transformed in relation to policy at other levels of government. So this is very important for me. So basically, I'm interested in the relation between spatial and discursive distribution of power. That sounded very nice. But more practically, I've completed over the last few years 3 studies on regional cultural policy. Ritva was saying that I always speak of regions. Actually, my real preference is municipalities. But since there's been a lot of interesting development at the regional level in Sweden during the last years, I've tried to focus on that. And 2010, I completed a comparative study of cultural policy identity construction in region Skåne and region Västra Götaland, which Torbjörn referred to earlier. They are still the largest and regions in Sweden, and they are also the regions that have come the furthest with developing a cultural policy which is more self-sufficient than the other regional cultural policies in relation to national government, and I come back to that. I also completed a comparative implementation study of a letter of intent between the Swedish Arts Council and region Skåne in two specific subfields, namely those of visual arts and public libraries. And then this year, just a month ago, I think, Erik, I completed, together with my colleague Roger Blomgren, a comparative implementation study of the cultural cooperation model, which is now called Kultursamverkansmodellen, is now the official name. Yeah, right. In two counties, the counties of Jämtland and Kronoberg. And here I was very intrigued with what Torbjörn said about how the national government language is still very much used as an instrument of power in relation to the regional level. And what was really interesting here was that, especially in Jämtland, it was very important that we use the term län. That is the term used by the national government, and not the term region or landsting, which are the terms used from below, from the regions themselves. So what I'll be saying here is really based on these three studies. So I'll really focus on the recent development. Now, Torbjörn touched upon this earlier about the development in Sweden. I'm very glad for that, since he gave a much better summary of the development concerning regionalisation in Sweden over the last few years. During the 1990s, as Torbjörn said, larger regions with increased self-governance formed in some parts of especially southern Sweden. And this, I will come back to, is no coincidence that it's in southern Sweden. And during 2008 to 2010, the Swedish Arts Council signed letters of intent with 8 regions or county councils, which I should have written, because I think that's a term that is used in English for landsting, while council is reserved for län. Am I right? County, sorry. County is reserved for län, and county councils is landsting. And what was interesting about these letters of intent were that they were kind of like a start of this process towards this new cultural cooperation model. And the new thing about this letter of intent was that the Swedish Arts Council actually invited the regions or county councils to a dialogue on what should be prioritized with, when putting the resources of the Swedish Arts Council and the county council and or the region together. So this was a new way of enacting national cultural policy in Sweden. But what was also important with these letters of intent were that they were not formally binding in any financial or legal sense. So they were an informal start to what then became the formal cultural cooperation model. In 2009, the report of the Swedish Committee of Inquiry on Cultural Policy submitted its very encompassing report. It was 600 pages, was it? Tobias? Many pages. And on some of these pages, actually the only proposal that the committee gave and that was actually implemented was the suggestion concerning a new model for distributing national funds to regional cultural activities, what has been called portföljmodellen, koffertmodellen, and now cultural cooperation model. In 2009, in December, the Swedish Parliament decided that this model should be enforced in Sweden. And in 2010, there was a special report from a special committee of inquiry that was only focused on how this model should be shaped and implemented. And from 2009 and onwards, all the initiatives, and Torbjörn referred to this also, towards expanding the regional organization that had been settled in some parts of southern Sweden, in Skåne, Västra Götaland, was stopped, for the reasons that Torbjörn gave you previously. And in 2011 and to 2013, the cultural cooperation model is implemented in all county councils in Sweden, except for Stockholm. And this is, of course, also very interesting and important. Now, if I try to summarize this model, have you even heard about it? No. As I said, it's a new model for distributing national government funds to regional cultural activities. Now, fully developed, it involves 1.2 billion Swedish crowns. But it's very important to notice that there are no new funds connected to the model. So the funds that are used are those that have been used previously to support regional cultural activities. But they are now distributed in a new way. Each region or county council, sorry for not writing this correctly, in the model is supposed to develop a plan for culture. And they're supposed to do this in cooperation with the municipalities and after a dialogue with professional cultural life and civil society. Then each plan for culture is approved by the Swedish Arts Council. And both regions and counties and the Arts Council are supposed to follow up the model, and the model is also evaluated by the recently established Myndigheten för kulturanalys. What are you called in English, Erik?
National Agency for Cultural Policy Analysis.
Thank you, and I'm sure you'll tell us more about you tomorrow. So this is very briefly. Now, to give you more insight into the model, I've used quotations from how the Swedish government presents the model, and then I provide my analysis of what they're saying. Now, firstly, the Swedish government say, the model of cultural cooperation means that the freedom and responsibility of the regions increase in the field of culture, and that culture is brought closer to citizens. Now here we can see, I think it's very important to mention at least three different concepts here. Now first, we could talk about regionalisation, which was actually the topic of our session. Now regionalisation, I would say, is a top-down notion, and it's concerned mainly with governmental welfare distribution. It's about how national government organizes a nation into regional entities in the way that is supposed to best fulfill national objectives. Regionalism is, I think, what Torbjörn referred to earlier by using the term region building as a bottom-up process, and which is concerned more with democratic participation by citizens. It's closely connected to also what Torbjörn mentioned, the more organic notion of landscapes. And for example, the most successful region in this sense, I would say in Sweden, is Skåne. And this is no coincidence, since the new region, which consists of an amalgamation of previous county councils, is actually identical to the landscape of Skåne, compared to Region Västra Götaland, which has had a lot more difficulties with actually filling the notion of a regional identity with any actual content, since it has no basis in one landscape, but in several, as Mats also pointed out. Now what's interesting in this quote also, I think, is that the national government refers to freedom and responsibility that is to be transferred to the regions. Now, I would ask, does this freedom and responsibility involve regionalisation or regionalism? And I think that you can guess that my answer will be that the national government leans towards regionalisation rather than regionalism, and I'll come back to this. But what's more important, I think, is that when we're here talking about regionalisation or centralisation, I think that what I would actually want to talk about is decentralisation or centralisation. Because what's really interesting from a municipal, local and regional perspective is, of course, whether this new model of collaboration actually involves the allocation of power from national government to regional government. So from now on, I'll speak of decentralization or centralization. The second quote second paragraph in the presentation given by the Swedish government is that the model is to contribute to increased fulfillment of the national cultural policy objectives and provide greater opportunities for regional priorities and variations. Now this is very interesting because it's a very clear expression, I would say, of how the national government governs by norms. And the norms that they're governing by is based on both old and new discursive content. The old discursive content is the same as ever in Western European cultural policy since the 1930s and onwards. Namely, that cultural policy should be about promoting professional fine arts within an institutional framework, but it should also promote participation in cultural life by as many citizens as possible. Now what's interesting here, it's not mentioned in the formal directives of the model, but it's mentioned in those instructions that the Swedish Arts Council developed in 2010, and that they very clearly state that the model, when implemented at the regional level, should apply the arm's length principle. Now what's really interesting, you've heard about that principle, yes? And what's really interesting about this, I think, is, and Roger Blomgren and I think so in our latest study, is that by expressing this explicitly, the Swedish Arts Council imply that the arm's length principle is not applied at the regional level. Now, I've studied so many regions and municipalities now so that I can feel quite sure to tell you that the arm's length principle is applied. It's also infringed, but on all levels of government. We have examples of censorship on local level, on the regional level, but also at the national level. But it's not more infringed on regional and local level than on the national level. There's, at least I know of no evidence of that. So what's interesting is that the national government implies that regional and local authorities, they don't really know what cultural policy should be about, and they go around, meddling in artistic content, if I'm doing a very mean interpretation. And just to be a bit provocative, I'll do that. Now, what's new discursive content in this governing by norms is, of course, that for the first time in cultural policy, as I know of, the national government actually says that welfare could be attained in the cultural policy field by divergence between regions rather than convergence, because previously the regional level has mainly been a vehicle for national cultural policy for quite natural reasons, as our previous speakers clearly pointed out. They're vehicles for national administration rather than regional and local administration. But for the first time, the national government actually states that, well, it could perhaps be a good idea if different regions or county councils do cultural policy in different ways. Now, this isn't only because the national government, of course, wants to be nice to regions and municipalities. It's also because we have that kind of government that wants to provide variation and diversity, mainly for economic reasons, to provide the basis for economic growth. If we continue with the next paragraph, the national government says that the state is to continue to have overall strategic responsibility for national cultural policy. Now this, you could say, is an example of governing by regulation, because when implemented, this model is very much governed by the directions that also the Swedish Parliament has granted. And in those directives, it's very clearly pointed out the aim and scope and division of responsibility. Now, for a very clear example of this is that the activities eligible for national funding within the model are only the 7 listed here. So this is a very clear-cut way for national government to direct cultural activities at the regional level, actually more clearly than before. The next paragraph says that the entire model is based on the further development of dialogue and interplay between central government and the regional level. The interplay between civil society and professional cultural life is also to increase. Now, this could be considered an example of governing by organization. The regional plans for culture that I told you about earlier, that are developed by the regions in cooperation with the municipalities and after dialogue with professional cultural life and civil society, has to be formally approved by the Swedish Arts Council. So the freedom and responsibility that was highlighted in the first paragraph isn't so far-reaching as the quotation would indicate. Also, since my main interest is actually local cultural policy, we can speak of centralisation in a different sense than what we have previously done. We have spoken only about centralisation in the sense that power is centralized to national government. But what's interesting with these new larger regions in particular, but also in those county councils that have tried other ways, other solutions to work across previous county council borders, is actually that the municipalities feel the power is centralized within the regional entity. And the first study that I referred to earlier that I did on Västra Götaland and region Skåne clearly shows that the municipalities almost consider the regional level a new kind of state, but at the regional level. So we have processes of centralization at different geographical scales. So what's the problem here in the model is that the local plans for culture, which are also actually being quite developed and revised during this process, has to be informally approved by the regional level. Since if they want to be included in the regional plan for culture, they have to adhere to the regional aims and objectives. And since the regional aims and objectives very clearly relate to the national government, we have a very evident example of centralization. And finally, Tobias will be speaking a lot more on civil society tomorrow, but I think that it's very interesting also that in the model, civil society, it could be, of course, considered a very good thing that when elaborating the regional plan for culture, civil society should be consulted. But in another sense, when I was thinking about this last night, when I was preparing my presentation, I was also thinking that it's also an interesting way of maybe colonizing, again, civil society, and that it's the public sector that actually colonizes civil society. Since, as you all know, civil society associations has formed the very foundation of large parts of cultural policy, not only in Sweden, but in all Nordic countries. And they have the older traditional civil society associations have almost become integrated into the public sector. So while I consider it a benefit that civil society should be involved in the process, of course, you could also see that they're being dragged into a process which doesn't necessarily mean that the perspectives of civil society will permeate cultural policy in the region. So, 2013, results so far. Of course, I've been a bit bold so far. Now I want to, take a step backwards and, of course, say that we can't really say anything about this model yet. Since it's just been implemented, we have to wait several years before we can see the actual consequences. So what I'm saying here today are based on the very rudimentary studies that I've performed so far, and it's only about what is evident in those studies. First, regionalisation. I think that it's very evident that we have a strengthened regional level in cultural policy in Sweden today. And I've labeled this as regionalisation deliberately, because I stated earlier that regionalisation is actually about how the national government organizes the nation into regional entities. And what's interesting here, I think, is that they've managed, the national government and the model has managed to make all regions in Sweden deliver regional cultural plans. And they encompass more than 1,000 pages, I know, since I read them all. And this is a historically unique fact, I would almost dare to state, because never previously have regional cultural policy authorities developed a cultural policy argument on so many pages, and this is interesting in itself. But what do these pages say? Now we turn to centralisation. I would say that up till now, the model has mainly resulted in enhanced national government control over regional and implicitly also over local cultural policy, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, since the municipalities have to relate to the regional framework, and the regional framework has to relate to the national framework. We have a process of centralization concerning cultural policy content, and this is very evident in the regional plans for culture. And concerning decentralization then, the actual allocation of national government power to regional authorities, I would say that size and location matters very much concerning how regions relate to initiatives to national government control. Now, this is of course no surprise to you, and it's quite self-evident that the larger regions, Skåne and Västra Götaland for example, resist national government control much more strongly than the smaller regions. And the reasons for that are of course obvious. The smaller regions have much less to lose, while the two regions of Västra Götaland and Region Skåne have established a cultural policy which is self-sufficient enough, and most importantly, they have the economic funds to actually put pressure on national government to a large extent. Having said that, I would say that they still haven't put any real pressure on national government. And no Swedish region has done this, so they basically accept this process. And what's interesting also, and also perhaps quite self-evident, is that regions in the south resist national government control more than regions in the north. And this is for the same reason as the larger versus the smaller, that since regions in the southern part of Sweden have much better prospects concerning the future financially, the regions in the north have much more to lose. If they don't receive the national funds to cultural activities, the regional activities will simply often disappear because you won't have the possibilities to fund them. Finally, what's interesting in the regional plans for culture and in all the 3 studies that I did is that the reproduction of national cultural policy discourses on all government levels continues to persist. So this very interesting organizational reform, which has contributed to changes in the organization of cultural policy at different levels of government, has of yet, in the studies that I did, not resulted in any change in cultural policy content. And I don't know if you've heard, but there was a lot of worry concerning the model when it was introduced, that cultural policy would become vulgarized and that the only culture that would receive regional funding would be festivals and Liseberg in Göteborg, that kind of thing. But none of this has actually happened. All regions continue to sustain the discourses that I also referred to earlier. The production of professional artistic activity at institutions, the dissemination of art of high quality and participation in cultural life, and at the regional level, most notably, but I would say at all levels of government today, sustainable development, which has been used very much as a vehicle in introducing the region as a notion in Swedish policymaking and in Swedish cultural policy, has over the years been translated increasingly into culture as a tool for economic growth and social inclusion. And I actually read, coming here today, an excellent article by Deborah Stevenson and Raoul McKay from 2010 that displays exactly the same features in Britain. So this is, of course, not a Swedish development, but this is a development that I think that we would recognize in most Western European countries, at least the countries I know. Oh, I have to finish, I see. So, I have my concluding remarks. What I've been trying to say, and this is important for me, I think, in my research, is that processes of change always run parallel. And I would find, in the cultural policy field at least, that they almost always run in different directions. You can't say in Sweden today that cultural policy is either regionalized or centralized. It's both. And I tried to display that earlier by saying that we have an enforced regional level, but we also have an increased national government control. The cultural cooperation model, though, seems more a tool for increased national government control, that is centralisation, than a tool for decentralisation. And again, I'd like to mention that this is not only a centralisation to the national level, but also from the local perspective, a centralisation to the regional level. Then I would also like to state that the reproduction of national cultural policy discourses, relating to my studies at least, tend to override both regional and local interests. Regions and municipalities choose to give priority to national cultural policy discourses while trying to argue that regions and municipalities should have a cultural policy that is specific to the local and regional setting. It also overrides political party interests. In all the studies that I've done, and it would include, I think now, maybe 80 cultural politicians and cultural administrators, they all agree that there are no real conflicts that can be related to political party ideology. And finally, of course, the really interesting question, and that which the national government opened up with in the first paragraph, they said that this whole model is about bringing culture closer to the citizens. And I would then ask, these processes of change that I've tried very briefly in a quite vulgar way to display to you, how do they relate to the interests of the citizens? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. There will be so many questions to you, but the time is running, so I put the floor, as we agreed to, Esa immediately to you, and then we have for discussion.
I feel so tall here. I have to take here. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the title which has been given to Jenny and me in this session is in the form either or. So it leaves the feeling that we have to choose one or the other alternative. I suppose that most of you guessed the choice when we discuss Finnish cultural policy. Finland is known as a state-centered nation with a homogeneous population that obeys the rules and laws set by the establishment, who or wherever it might be. A new and a sudden turn in our EU policy nowadays has not changed this tendency, which is deeply embedded in the longer processes of history. What about cultural policy in the historic view? If we take a broader view of it, we have to look at what has happened within the context of civilizing policy. The school system was established in the 1860s within the atmosphere of the evolving civil society. In the 19th century, the school system and educational policy became intertwined with nation-state policies. After attaining independence in 1917, the nation's educational policy was the principal means by which the unity of the new state and the homogeneity of the people was to be secured. With the help of Lutheran Church, Cultural values were part of that policy at all times. In terms of arts policy, the nation's cultural policy began also in the 19th century. For example, there were marks of financial support system by the state in the 1860s. The state also organized other activities in the field of cultural life in the following decades. The state made its cultural policy a part of the public policy sector in the same way as it had its civilizing policy. The golden age of Finnish art took place within the context of highly tuned expectations for national culture. In the first years of independence, the state was eager to make use of the artists and their works. The works of art were in the service of making and polishing the image of Finland. This phase in Finnish cultural policy has been labeled the first or big line. It lasted until the 1960s. Symbolically, we could say that by taking this line, the state booked a room in the House of Cultural Policy, a room from which it could observe the performances in the house, meet those who were living there, and receive visitors and delegates. Essentially, the state aimed to favor and patronize cultural life and at the same time to supervise it. To say that Finland has a centralized cultural policy model is not to say that it is or has been entirely centralized. Some scholars, for example Zacharias Sokka, have indicated that there was also notable activity by private individuals and associations that organized cultural life in the 19th century. There were also, then and later, different views on culture and its status in society. On the other hand, this view essentially changes nothing in the big picture. Centralization shapes the plot in the story of Finnish cultural policy, but it is not the story in and of itself. The starting point for the second big line coincides with the social welfare policy. This, however, took place a decade or so later than it did, for example, in France, and also some years later than for example, in Sweden. A system of arts councils and a system that offered financial support to artists and art institutions were established at the end of the 1960s. These were launched by a committee which based its view of culture, still somewhat innocently, on the arts and the supposedly autonomous status of culture in society. Later, the official view of culture and its status became more closely intertwined with the social welfare policy and its aims to extend cultural services to everyone. In 1974, a new committee used the words arts and culture. Those words were also used in the documents of the Ministry of Education and, for example, in the state budgets. Obviously, this change was based on a trend to define culture as a way of life and to acknowledge the effects of such things as mass culture and mass media on culture. As one consequence, a bill for the promotion of municipal cultural activities was passed in 1980. The new bill was a way to regionalize, or actually localize, the state's cultural policy within the context of a centralized model. Municipalities now had more power to shape cultural policy, but only with the help and even according to the demands of the state. The bill provided government subsidies so that municipalities could organize special cultural boards and appoint cultural officials to them, and by this way to have more cultural events and activities to people. Where there then was a room for local or regional will and initiative. There may have been some initiatives at that time to if not turn over, but at least to balance the existing cultural policy model. But they were not successful. It may be that there was no need for this because the state knew more and better, and this knowing better benefited cultural life just like the social welfare policy benefited all of social life to a certain extent. And it may be that there was not enough urge among the people to change the cultural policy. The third big line in Finnish cultural policy began at the beginning of the 1990s. It was a postmodern age with shining and perhaps also delusive views of a new kind of world. For cultural policy, this age seemed to offer a unique chance to deliver on the promises that had been presented internationally since the 1970s. Culture is a source of creativity and diversity, and this is why cultural policy had much more potential than had yet been actualized. Now, social philosophers argued that it was culture, not society, which, with speedy and sweeping changes in technologies, consumption and globalization, would be a key concept for understanding what was happening around us and even to us. Liberty, imagination and crossovers were the nets that stimulated individuals, subcultures and local life. No wonder then that the next Committee for Cultural Policy Issues, which was organized at the beginning of the 1990s, liked to question the concept of culture by saying, "Come on, we are elitists no more. Look at the concept of culture and define it all over again. Who will start?" Nobody volunteered. Yes, sure, this call for all, such as the committee's will to take a step outside the habitual state understanding and agenda, can be viewed as just an echo of the postmodern mode in fashion at that time. And of course, the committee had its own definitions too. In any case, it could be asked, was there a passing moment to change Finnish cultural policy at that time? To answer that, we have to look at what else happened at the same time. Along with the cultural turn and its possibilities, a new business-like ideology, performance management, was put into operation. And as a consequence, the legitimacy of politics were to be settled by the canon of productivity, profitability and effectiveness. This can be viewed as a win for economic policy at the expense of other policies, cultural policy among them. At the regional level, the performance management system extended to all of the state authorities. Otherwise, nothing special happened. But this was due to the status of this level of our administration system. We do not have any type of regional self-government in Finland. No specific demands for regional autonomy have ever been highlighted. In the administration system, the most powerful organizations have been provincial governments so long as they existed. Even they were more state offices in the provinces than particular governments with elected delegates. They had no proper cultural policy tasks, but they had possibilities to highlight provincial cultures via their authority, if they liked to do so. Some years ago, provincial governments were displaced by new and complex joint offices, but without the eminence of the provincial governments. One office is responsible for economy, labor force and environment issues, the other one for public services, legal rights, permits, police and so on. It would be possible to see this kind of development as a withdrawal of the state from the provinces, if such a thing would be possible. In 1994, municipally based county councils or regional councils were given some new assignments and more formal influence. They have their own plans and programs for promoting economic life, regional planning, and so forth. Culture is one of the tasks, among others, that county councils are now in charge of. However, in practice, they have few means, if at all, to make cultural policy in the exact meaning of the word. In the plans, culture is but one factor in the operational environment for economic life. In addition, it is part of certain plans to nurture authentic local county culture, whatever that might be. However, what is worth noticing in a cultural policy context is the fact that the county councils have a part in allocating EU regional funds, and that those funds are a significant additional source of income for cultural activities at this level, especially when we are talking about culture in the broader sense of the word, not only arts. If this money is used for justified targets, then it will be good for the regions. It will be good for cultural policy too, on the condition that we accept the larger view of its aims. So, it is possible to see that this EU allocation embodies, in a modest form, possibilities to implement cultural policy from the bottom up, although the use of those EU funds on a larger scale is also in line with national and even EU policies, of course. In the proper cultural policy view, we cannot dismiss regional art councils, which were established at the same time as the national art councils some 40 years ago. They are an organic part of the art council system. Otherwise, their status is a little bit odd. At the beginning, they were steered by the Minister of Education. Then they were unified with provincial governments, but not actually governed by them. An idea may have been that in this unity, art and culture would have been influenced more by regional policy and regional policy more by art and culture. In the last years, the art councils have been steered by the central Finnish Arts Council. And this is not all. In the unity of provincial governments, the regional arts council were also appointed by the provincial governments. Some years ago, they were appointed by the county councils, and now they will be appointed by the Central Arts Council, renamed Arts Promotion Centre. These quirks may underline the weakness of the regional level in Finnish cultural policy, or at least how complicated it is to organize it. The question is, should the art councils be in the line with national cultural policy, actually arts policy, or should they be aligned more with regional policy? When we discuss municipalities, we have to take account the law that was enacted in 1992. By this law, the state allocated state subsidies to the municipalities or the foundations and private owners connected with them to cover the expenses of cultural institutions, museums, theatres and orchestras. It was a situation of now or never, because at the same time the state wanted to liberate the municipalities from excessive norms under the ideology of a new public management. As a consequence, and due to some measures that were passed in the 1990s and later, the municipalities nowadays have the authority to decide how they want to spend the state subsidies. They also decide what kind of boards they have to handle cultural affairs, cultural matters, and some other services and actions. The municipalities have the power to decide if they want to have cultural officials or not. These kinds of decisions had been steered previously by the state on the basis of the bill enacted in 1980. Now, after the law has been changed, there are only a few municipalities with cultural experts, and there are joint boards with other sectors, for example, the leisure time board or the educational board, and nowadays even a kind of well-being board or lifestyle board. What should we conclude about these changes within our context? In Finland, the state and the municipalities are the main administrational actors when it comes to cultural policy, just like they are for social policy. Together, they are in charge that society and culture works on or function. As a matter of fact, the municipalities are more influential if we compare the share of funding. The municipalities fund more culture than the state. In this sense, we could say that cultural policy in Finland is not as centralized as has been argued. In the near future, this will be even more evident if a proposed reform to form joint municipalities is to be realized, and if, as a consequence of this, the status of regional councils would, as well as regional state offices, would more or less fade away. Then new types of large municipalities will appear as both local and regional actors. But will they have more actual influence in terms of cultural policy? Or will they have better competence when making cultural policy? And will they highlight more authentic local or regional features in cultural policy than smaller municipalities or traditional regional authorities has been able to do? The municipalities are essentially autonomous, but in practice they are bound together with the state in many ways. In cultural policy, the system of allocating state subsidies, mainly to cultural institutions, is based on law, although without earmarking the subsidies for arts and culture. The tasks of the municipalities in cultural policy are based on law, although not in any exact way, and even though cultural services have not been qualified to serve as basic services. In practice, the state steers the municipalities even more by way of information, ideas and ideologies. Policy programs are being used, as are the ideas of new public management with an emphasis on governance and evaluations, as well as on new models to organize services, for example, in cooperation or partnerships between public, private and civil society actors. In principle, there is space for local or even regional cultural policy in Finland if the future lies in the large municipalities. It has been proved in a study by Anita Kangas and Vilja Ruokalainen that large municipalities are less dependent on state subsidies than smaller ones. Thus, the large municipalities might manage to make more influential cultural policy on some conditions. For example, if they invest in culture as they state in their visions or in their programs. If they will have new kinds of cultural managers working closer to the core power in municipal administration, and if there will be a new understanding, equal communication, shared interest and enough common power within the members of the joint boards. On the other hand, to be big is not self-evidently to be enlightened. The same study proved that smaller municipalities are in some cases even more inclined to actively invest in local culture than larger ones, but of course with fewer resources. It may be that the large municipalities will be more inclined to compete with each other, and they will do this by placing more emphasis on economic rather than cultural values. In any case, the coupling between the state and the municipalities is ethical by nature. When we discuss cultural policy in Finland, this ethics has evolved as part of the process of civilizing people in Finland, in building and defending the nation state, and in supporting social welfare policies. This is the big story behind the big lines of cultural policy. For the present, it seems like the enlightened ethos of the social welfare policy is still alive and well when it comes to cultural policy. As I stated before, the municipalities nowadays have the freedom to use cultural state subsidies wherever they want, not only for arts and culture. There have been some, but only some cases lately where the Minister of Education and Culture has left notes for those municipalities that have not allocated this money for arts and culture. Without the help of earmarked laws and with a little help from the Court of Law, the Supreme Administrative Court, no significant damage has been suffered in relation to culture. This is good, but of course in the ideal world of a cultural-based society and in administration system based on a more local or even kind of regional autonomy, there should be not any suspicion about investing in culture. Thank you for listening to me. And I think that the chair of this session is an experienced expert on comparing Finland's model of cultural policy to other models in international level, and so we can more discuss. Thank you.